lose their sharpness on a wider view. In the panorama that would ultimately fill the mind, these so-called goods and virtues could not be conceived without their complementary vices and evils. Thus all moral consciousness, and even all vital preference, might ultimately be superseded. They might appear to have belonged to a partial and a rather low stage in the self-development of consciousness. With this dissolution of his moral judgments always in prospect, why should Bradley, or any idealist, have pursued ethical studies at all? Since all phases of life were equally necessary to enrich an infinite consciousness, which must know both good and evil in order to merge and to transcend them, he could hardly nurse any intense enthusiasm for a different complexion to be given to the lives of men. His moral passion, for he had it, caustic and burning clear, was purely intellectual. It was shame that in England moral consciousness should have been expressed in systems dialectically so primitive as those of the positivists and utilitarians. He acknowledged, somewhat superciliously, that their hearts were in the right place. Yet if we are to have ethics at all, were not their thoughts in the right place also? They were concerned not with analysis of the moral consciousness, but with the conduct of affairs and reform of institutions. The spectacle of human wretchedness profoundly moved them. Their minds were bent on transforming society, so that a man's station and its duties might cease to be what a decayed feudal organization and an inhuman industrialism had made of them. They revolted against the miserable condition of the masses of mankind, and against the miserable consolations which official religion, or a philosophy like Bradley's, offered them in their misery. The utilitarians were at least intent on existence and on the course of events. They wished to transform institutions to fit human nature better, and to educate human nature by those new institutions, so that it might better realize its latent capacities. These are matters which a man may modify by his acts, and they are therefore the proper concern of the moralists. Were they much to blame if they neglected to define pleasure or happiness, and used catchwords, dialectically vague, to indicate a direction of effort, politically quite unmistakable? Doubtless their political action, like their philosophical nomenclature, was revolutionary, and relied too much on wayward feelings ignorant of their own causes. Revolution, no less than tradition, is but a casual and clumsy expression of human nature in contact with circumstances. Yet pain and pleasure and spontaneous hopes, however foolish, are directed expressions of that contact, and speak for the soul, whereas a man's station and its duties are purely conventional, and may altogether misrepresent his native capacities. The protest of human nature against the world and its oppressions is the strong side of every rebellion. It was the moral side of utilitarianism, and of the rebellion against irrational morality. Unfortunately, the English reformers were themselves idealists of a sort, entangled in the vehicles of perception, and talking about sensations and ideas, pleasures and pains, as if these had been the elements of human nature, or even of nature at large, and only the most meagre of verbal systems and the most artificial can be constructed out of such materials. Moreover, they spoke much of pleasure and happiness, and hardly at all of misery and pain, whereas it would have been wiser and truer to their real inspiration to have laid all the emphasis on evils to be abated, leaving the good to shape itself in freedom. Suffering is the instant and obvious sign of some outrage done to human nature. Without this natural recoil, actual or imminent, no morality could have any sanction, and no precept could be imperative. What silliness to command me to pursue pleasure or to avoid it, if in any case everything would be well. Save for some shadow of dire repentance looming in the distance, I am deeply free to walk as I will. The choice of pleasure for a principle of morals was particularly unfortunate in the British utilitarians. It lent them an air of frivolity absurdly contrary to their true character. Pleasure might have been a fit enough word in the mouth of Aristippus, a semi-Oriental untouched by the least sense of responsibility, or even on the lips of humanists in the 18th century, who, however sordid their lives may sometimes have been, could still move in imagination to the music of Mozart, in the landscape of Watteau or Fragonard. But in the land and age of Dickens, the moral idea was not so much pleasure as kindness. This tenderer word not only expresses better the motive at work, but it points to the distressing presence of misery in the world to make natural kindness laborious and earnest, and turn it into a legislative system. Bradley's hostility to pleasure was not fanatical. One's station and its duties might have their agreeable side. "It is probably good for you," he tells us, "to have, say, not less than 2 glasses of wine after dinner. 6 on ordinary occasions is perhaps too many. But as to 3 or 4, they are neither one way nor the other." If the voluptuary was condemned, it was for the commonplace reason that such a hedonist, too, might invoke that a life of pleasure soon palls and becomes unpleasant. Bradley's objection to pleasure was merely speculative. He found it too abstract. To call a pleasure, when actually felt, an abstraction, is an exquisite absurdity. But pleasure, in its absolute essence, is certainly simple and indefinable. If, instead of enjoying it on the wing, and as an earnest of the soul's momentary harmony, we attempt to arrest and observe it, we find it strangely dumb. We are not informed by it concerning its occasion, nor carried from it by any logical implications to the natural object in which it might be found. A pure hedonist ought therefore to be rather relieved if all images lapsed from his consciousness, and he could luxuriate in sheer pleasure, dark and overwhelming. True, such bliss would be rather inhuman, and of the sort which we rashly assign to the oyster. But why should a radical and intrepid philosopher be ashamed of that? The condition of Bradley's absolute, feeling in which all distinctions are transcendent and merged, seems to be something of that kind. But there would be a strange irony in attributing this mystical and rapturous ideal to such ponderous worthies as Mill and Spencer, whose minds were nothing if not anxious, perturbed, instrumental, and full of respect for variegated facts, and who were probably incapable of tasting pure pleasure at all. But if pleasure in its pure essence might really be the highest good for a mystic who should be lost in it, it would be no guide to a moralist wishing to control events, and to distribute particular pleasures or series of pleasures as richly as possible in the world. For this purpose he would need to understand human nature and its variable functions, in which different persons and peoples may find their sincere pleasures, and this knowledge would first lend to his general love of pleasure any point of application in the governance of life, or in benevolent legislation. Some concrete image of a happy human would take the place of the futile truism that pleasure is good and pain evil. This is, of course, what utilitarian moralists meant to do, and actually did, in so far as their human sympathies extended, which was not to the highest things, but it was not what they said, and Bradley had a clear advantage over them in the war of words. A pleasure is not a program. It exists here and not there, for me and no one else, once and never again. When past, it leaves the will as empty and as devoid of allegiance as if it had never existed. Pleasure is sand, though it have the colour of gold. But this is evidently true of all existence. Each living moment, each dead man, each cycle of the universe, leaves nothing behind it but a void which perhaps something kindred